1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is David Lloyd. David is the former proprietor and vineyard at Eldridge Estate in Red Hill on the Mornington Peninsula. David now lives in Tasmania, but came to see me in Shoreham when he was visiting friends on the peninsula. We got to know each other when I sort of helped out during harvest back in the day. For this conversation, we talked about a yeast skeptic's Riesling stealing misdemeanours, why Chardonnay is fit for a queen, formidable forehands and backhanded compliments, the peninsula's pathway to Pinot prowess, love and loss on a precious patch of dirt, making friends as Malo Man, the baby steps of a future Grange maker, miscellaneous misfits and odd couples. I started by asking David where he got his first taste of wine.
I think I'm going to start with being a young person teething, and I think you know where this is going, Ed. And my father was the rector at St Jude's Brighton in South Australia, and apparently when I was teething and screaming, my mother dipped what these days is trendily called a pacifier, we always called him a dummy, in Hardy's black bottle brandy, and that apparently pacified me very quickly. But he either married or baptised all the Thomas Hardy and Son family, and I knew Eileen Hardy as Auntie Eileen, and we used to have family picnics at Tintara, and Easter, Christmas was the typical family thing. And I remember we didn't have champagne. We had this odd-shaped bottle with a plastic closure called Barossa Pearl. But then the other wines were Hardy's. We're going back here to the 50s. And my brother ended up doing the advertising for Thomas Hardy and Son, purely coincidental because he was with another company that got taken over by an American company but ended up with the Hardy's account. And then when I started university and needed a summer job and was thinking of swapping from Monash to Flinders University, I stayed with my brother and his wife and my much-loved nieces, Megan and Christine, over the whole summer vacation as you have at university. And my job was working at Thomas Hardy's bottling line in Mile End, which was an unbelievable experience. Hardy's black bottle, still, I remember that, and being called over by the guys lifting the hoses and have to drain the last bit of... And they said, "Oh, put your gob under this, mate." And this great slug of brandy goes at about 10 o'clock in the morning because you start at about 7 a.m. in. And, so I guess I can blame Hardy's too, can't I?
Yeah, and did that turn into more of a job?
No. At that stage, I went into biological sciences at Monash, and I actually got fascinated with physiology and pharmacology and decided that the future employment I needed to work in a hospital as a operating theatre technician as my part-time job. And about 2 years later, when Wendy and I decided to get married, and her mother said, "Well, you better speak to Ed," that was her father, who was quite a fearful figure.
Right.
He said, "Well, lad, how are you going to support my daughter in the style?" So I actually showed him my tax return, and Wendy at that stage was a first-year teacher, and I was earning more than she was. I was not only working at the operating theatre part-time and through vacations, but I was also delivering grog and then pulling beers at the Notting Hill pub at Monash. So I went down this biological pathway, and that ended up going even further at the end of third year university, so we're talking 1975, and I loved pharmacology. My parents both died in the 1 year, Mum in February and Dad in October, and of course the funeral for my father was on the final exam for pharmacology. And at that stage, you just got a deferral, and it was essentially the same as what's called a supplementary exam. So if you near passing but fail, they give you a second chance, or if you're like me who couldn't make the exam. And so I studied up and sat the exam, drove home thinking, well, I seem to understand all that, and it's not often you can come out of an exam feeling confident. Yeah. And then Professor Bentley, he rings up and says, oh, David, I'm ringing to see if you want to do honours. And of course, me being a bit slow, said, oh, does this mean I passed? So I went into pharmacology research for that year. It was the first year that pharmacology was its own department out of medicine in science. And I had a big lab all to myself with all the machines that go ping. And the academics on campus thought I was a postdoctoral person and invited me to join their wine club.
Right.
And then that's when it got really serious.
So what were your first experiences? Obviously, you had a very early one with your brandy and your dummy, but of appreciating wine or listening to people talk about it in a way that made you think, well, this could be more interesting than I thought.
I think probably when I was in the early days of university and friends would be having a glass of wine and I didn't particularly enjoy it. And I've always been the kind of person that says what I think, which gets me into lots of trouble. And then we started a student wine club, and that got incredibly serious because, of course, being students, you don't have much of a budget. So we decided we'd bottle our own wine, and in those days you could go along and you could get from a winery a stainless steel 44 or a plastic version of that and set up a little bottling system yourselves. So the student club, we essentially looked, I think, probably something like 70 different bulk wines that were available at the time. And that had another big impact in terms of my marriage later on too, which I'll get to in a minute. But the search for finding a really good bulk wine worked down this little rabbit hole of endless discussions and tastings. You'd go to a region like Rutherglen and you'd get maybe 3 or 4 different possibilities from different wineries. And then I might go to Clare or the Barossa, McLaren Vale, Coonawarra. And it was always a discussion that led somewhere. And my brother-in-law, who was at that time the Deputy High Commissioner in Kuala Lumpur, I went over and stayed with them at Christmas. And I arrived, and it was kind of funny because the reputation of going into Singapore or Malaysia in terms of drugs and hairy students. And I was asked or tasked with taking in for Christmas a whole lot of goodies that included things like fresh raspberries, strawberries, and wines that they had selected. And diplomats seem to know about wine. And I was thinking, I'm going to go into jail. And there's these limits how much you could take. So I farmed them out to the other students on the plane.
Get them in jail as well.
Yeah. And we get to the customs entry sort of thing. And I'm thinking, well, this is working out all right. I could see the other people each with a couple of bottles of wine. And then my brother-in-law, who was 6'5", comes striding through. And I'm thinking, how the hell does he get in? But of course, he's a diplomat. He's got this red passport going dip, dip, dip. And just grabs me and takes me out. And there's the chauffeur with the car and about to drive off. And I said, Roger, we can't go yet. There's all this stuff coming out. So that worked out at a Christmas, coincidentally looking at more wines. And he had home bottled wine. And it was quite nice. And a year later, after my parents had both died, and Wendy and I had decided to get married, and future father-in-law.
By this time, he's well on your side.
Yeah, well, he was getting, yeah. I dropped in to see them, and they were bottling their own wine. And he comes out and he says, "You're the lad, are you?" And I said, yeah. And he said, "I believe you know something about wine. What's this?" And he hands me a glass of wine. And unbeknownst to him, it was the same wine that my brother-in-law, Roger, had bottled. And I'd also done this massive search of what you could buy around the country. And I said, I think that's Hamilton's, Springton, Shiraz Cabernet, 1972. He says, "Oh, you're okay, lad. In you come."
That's interesting. And when you say you were tasting and all these conversations came up when you were tasting bulk wine, so at that stage, are we talking about an analytical sense or literally just discussing what you like?
I think it was discussing what you like. And that's what it's all about. Mm. And these days when I have lots of high-powered tastings with various wanker friends, the first question is usually like, well, do you like the wine?
Mm.
And I have one particular friend who every now and then throws up something like Domaine de la Romney Conti La Tâche, and I think I've said, no, I don't, I think it's rubbish, about 3 times. And you could see the look on the face. What? How could you say that about a wine worth thousands of dollars? And then they often say, well, yeah, I agree. But again, the honest approach, I've always found people are quite open to it, even if it's their own wine.
As a hairy student, you were also a hairy tennis playing student, were you not?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the tennis.
Well, that was another thing, probably due to my father. The rest of my family were all gifted sportsmen, as in my siblings, and they were considerably older than me. My mother openly said that I was an accident, and contraception wasn't as good in those days, you know, dear. And I think she was 44 when I was born, and all my siblings were crack sportsmen. And I remember the famous story of about 1955. My mother was in Brighton and Adelaide, and it was really stormy weather, and there was huge waves on the beach, and there were these guys out surfing, and there was a woman in the car with my mother, and she said, what are those idiots doing out there? And she said, oh, that's my son. He's been selected as a demonstration sport for the Olympics. And when he died, aged 64, his handicap was still 4. Wow. He was also a very gifted tennis player. Both sisters were gifted tennis players, apart from the oldest sister, who was a bookworm, and she graduated with an honours degree at Adelaide University at about 20. The other two were almost kicked out of school at about year 9 because they were always in trouble and not interested in school. And suddenly you have somebody who's an absolute science nerd. And I would be reading encyclopedias when I was about 4 or 5 and totally into science. I could explain how a valve worked, a principle of thermionic emission, when I was about 9 to people. And science was down that path. And one day my father came home from a funeral, and the neighbour came running out and said, I think your house burnt down, or there was something happening at the vicarage. And he came into the backyard, and there was a 6-foot burn mark in the lawn. And he said, have you been launching rockets again? And of course I had. And I was working on a bigger one at the time. And at that stage he sort of thought, this son is getting too nerdy. I need to get him into sport. So he took me down to the church tennis club and said to the coach, you've got to get this kid into tennis. And I got really into tennis and would practice a lot. And I ended up being selected in the school first tennis team, which was a private school, so it's important to be playing well. Then it went on at university. We played with the university team, and we ended up winning for Monash University the InterVarsity Championship. When was that? January 75, and that was played at Memorial Drive in Adelaide. And I was a very serious tennis-loving person. Not naturally gifted, obviously, as a lot of practice went on. So, yes, it was a lot of work, but we still won that first ever title for Monash University's InterVarsity team. When I went teaching Peninsula School, I was head of tennis, so as well as trying to run a vineyard, I was coaching kids and running tennis practice 3 or 4 nights a week, and Saturday sport, of course, as well as having social competition tennis 1 or 2 nights a week. So I was doing a bit of tennis.
Yeah, lots to cram in. And it's remained a big part of your life to travel around and keep going, French Open especially, but coupling that with a bit of time at Wimbledon when you can as well. Yeah,
I get a great deal of enjoyment out of watching it. But sadly, I haven't missed an Australian Open since 73, but I'm not intending to go again, because if anybody's watched the tennis for the French Open and the Australian Open, they've got the same problem. They're getting corporatised, and people are going along for the experience rather than the tennis. One tournament stands supreme, and that is Wimbledon. Being a private club that's so affluent it's just not funny, you can still get decent seats there, and it's a very enjoyable thing to visit, and they're very respectful, if I put it that way, and it's a great experience 4 rounds. So you'll probably still see me going to the odd Wimbledon. And the US Open is another tournament where if you're prepared to front up with the dollars, you can get a decent seat.
Yeah. I think perhaps as much as wine, people's tastes in tennis players reveals quite a lot about them. So over those decades, which are the men and women that you've really loved watching and admired the way that they go about their business on a tennis court?
Very tricky question. A lot of the women players I've enjoyed watching, particularly those who graft. Steffi Graf just blew me away. I had a photographer's pass at the Australian Open for a few years and just watch what's going on. And the photographers would take almost like a betting pool on how many minutes it would take Steffi to destroy her opponent. And that'd be right up to about the semi-final stage. The confidence in looking at a player who goes about a business like that. So I think I'd put her down as somebody I thought was outstanding. And then in terms of the male players, I thought Rod Laver, taking it back a long time, he had the mental fortitude to just find a way to get there and win and graft. And as well as being a bloody left-hander, and if you've ever played left-handers and tennis people, you know what I'm talking about, the ball that swings into your body and they drive me potty. And of course the other one is Federer, who just glided around the court and made it look so easy, and he had so much skill. And I think Ash Barty in recent terms, I love watching the skill she had at mixing up the game, and watching recently Novak Djokovic playing Sinner, and he almost got there, and it was purely a tactical game because Sinner just brutalised the ball. And on clay, to see somebody almost overpower everybody with that pure power, and there was Novak purely tactical with the control, having his body under command, that was pretty good. So there you go.
Yeah, grudging respect for Novak Djokovic. And an honourable mention, I think, mentioning Ash Barty, how natural I think she was and how adaptable. Martina Hingis, I wish we'd seen a bit more of her because I thought she had a lovely flow and touch.
She did too.
So we've got tennis, we've got a bit of teaching and a lot of nerdiness and science going on. We've talked about wine. Now we need to go into, well, when did you start making it? What was the thing that flicked that switch?
It was probably that academics wine group from Monash. I became very friendly, as often happens at university, with Professor Bentley, Jeff Bentley, and he'd worked on sabbaticals around the world, and particularly in England, and quite liked Burgundy. And the Monash wine group had a tasting of Burgundies. So I said to Jeff, you ought to come along with this. It was all served blind. And these guys who were from the med faculty were saying on this side the Côte de Nuit was they had a bit of hail and they got a bit of damage, so the fruit wasn't so good. But over there in the Côte de Beaune, it was quite different, and so you got riper fruit characters coming through. And it turned out to be a 1967 Darrenberg Burgundy,
which, just for listeners, is not from Burgundy.
Yep. It was a Grenache. and I often describe really good Grenache as sort of like Pinot Noir on steroids. And it was a lovely wine. But there's another wine in the group, and I'm thinking, well, I think this is a French wine, but I'm not all that experienced at that stage. And Jeff said, well, it reminds me of Gevrey Chambertin. I used to like Gevrey Chambertin when I was working in London. And of course it was. So you had the two humblest people in the group thinking, well, we're doing okay. And that really got me looking seriously at wine. And then they just wouldn't shut up about Riesling. And how Brian Crozer, this wunderkind, was making a new generation of Riesling. And he'd used this super yeast, and it was giving fabulous flavours. And of course, I'm an arrogant young male student doing honours research who's done biochemistry, and I'm thinking, well, it's just a series of enzymatic reactions. The yeast aren't going to have any damned effect on the flavour, are they? So I contacted the Australian Wine Research Institute and obtained what's called yeast cultures as slopes, and I had 4 different yeasts I worked with. I decided then I'd make some Coonawarra Riesling, and I hope I'm not going to be put in jail for saying this in public. I stole the fruit. I was making some Cabernet, and I'd hopped the fence to the next vineyard, which I was told by my mate Prof.
Don't get him in trouble as well.
that it was Wynn's Riesling, and so we made about 20 litres of this stuff and settled it and put it into 4 1-gallon glass flagons, we called them, and one I had a bit higher sulfur dioxide level in it and put it in the fridge, and the other 3 I fermented with 3 different yeasts, one of which was the yeast that Crozer was playing with apparently. And bugger me, they were so different. It was chalk and cheese. And, there's a term we have in Australia about it's got you by the ghoulies. And that's basically what happened. That I just was so enamoured with this science. And you knew about wine being an art form, but the science behind it started to jump up and grab my attention. At that stage, I got the 4th container out of the fridge and inoculated it with the favourite yeast of the 3. So I had 4 wines, and I could show it to anybody and say to them, 2 of these are the same. Can you pick what they are? And they could all pick it, whether they were a heavy smoker, beer-drinking person who would say, oh, this is a tosser's game. Oh, yeah, there's 2 the same, just by the nose. And it sort of vindicated this feeling and made me feel like, oh, okay, I was really wrong there, wasn't I? But I was the first to admit it. And when I started making wine, the first vintage was obviously 75, and that was buying fruit at the market in what was called a banana box in those days. And I was encouraged to do it, dare I say it, in something called natural winemaking. Let it all hang out. And it ended up down the drain. I described it as having the flavour quality somewhere between vinegar and nail polish remover. Definitely not drinkable. And
quite trendy though in some spots.
Yeah, I was ahead of the curve. And I did that again the following year. And at that stage I planted a small vineyard and was going to take that down the track further. And we made wine from Cabernet, Peter Chambers' vineyard in Rutherglen, and that turned out quite nice. And the following year, after having shown Doug Bowen and Joy this wine I was quite proud of, the comment was, oh, I think you can do better than that, David. I'm thinking, oh, right, okay. And that's when he said, go talk to Prof down the road and get some decent fruit from Coonawarra. So that was when we started to get serious, and the first Coonawarra wine got a bronze medal alongside big hitting Yarra Valley producers at the Liddydale Wine Show. The following year, 1981, that also did pretty well. And the interesting story about that was one of the people I used to teach with, I could just call him Peter for now, I said to the staff, oh, I'm down a picker. Anybody want to come to Coonawarra for the weekend to help me pick my Cabernet? And Peter, who was into wine at that stage, said, oh, I'll come along. So that was the 1980, and we actually used Doug Bowen's facility to process it, which was really funny because the machine sort of went bloop, and there was my hand-picked ton and a bit of fruit done and we spent the next 2 hours cleaning all the gear. And I had dinner with Peter and his wife Gail about 6 weeks ago in Adelaide. He's a fairly well-known winemaker now, and the bugger brought out that same wine. He's had it in his cellar all this time, and it was actually quite drinkable. So yeah, grabbed by the ghoulies with that, and still looking good. So what was that, 1980? So we're looking at 45-year wine there.
And so what was the young Peter Gago look like? I've never actually met him, but I see him obviously in lots of airbrushed marketing material, showing off wines to crazy rich Asians for Penfolds. But back in those days, it looked like a wild bunch that you were, and probably having a lot of fun together. Was it obvious that he was destined for greater things? And what was the Bowen sort of being welcomed into that sort of family fold and getting on with that? Was that another, not a grab by the ghoulies moment as well, not just the fact that you were making stuff, but having fun?
Yeah, and I think we were very lucky because Brian, alias Prof at Magella, is one of those absolutely larger-than-life characters who just embraces things, and he embraced all my friends. And we used to sleep on the floor in his lounge room in sleeping bags, and I'd take up some Aussie fizz with croissant for breakfast the first morning. Then we'd get out cracking, picking the grapes. And Bowen was a great friend and gave huge advice. And I absolutely loved Coonawarra, and being originally from South Australia, it sort of felt like I was almost home, even if it was just across the border. And Peter was very serious, but loved wine, absolutely loved wine. And he was teaching, and Gail, his wife, well, they weren't married then, had gone back to university. She'd been a nurse, and she was doing a degree with the idea of advancing rather than being a nurse her whole life. And she ended up being Cabinet Secretary in the state government of South Australia. And before getting into politics, she covered the bill, shall we say, when Peter went to Roseworthy. And Peter was still quite approachable. And one of the things I found great to hear was I was talking to Peter about teaching, and he still gets to see, at least I think once a year, people he used to teach with as a person who works with educating and talking to people and communicating. I think that set in place something for later in life. And it's one thing to have a good palate, it's another to be a good winemaker, but to actually communicate all that information so that people are interested and don't have the glassy-eyed look that you've gone over the top is important. And Peter absolutely nails that. And we had a fabulous evening with him. I don't see him as a person who's changed fundamentally. He's a great communicator and loves wine. And a particular love is on the side, like mine, is champagne. And we always start with a couple of nice champagnes.
Yeah, which he's now producing in collaboration. Have you tasted it?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Because you're a big champagne fan. We should also say that.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't had enough of the recent ones. And the previous one where they used Yatana barrels, I quite like an oak influence in champagne, and I thought that was good. And obviously, reading between the lines, they might have got smacked around a bit by the industry heavies, that it was a bit too oaky. But I thought it worked really well. And there's a couple of famous champagnes that use oak, and there's one who's a bit of a cult. And they use this oxidised style that some people would call bruised apple, and I really loathe that. And what I will say about all the champagnes that Penfolds is producing is they're as clean as a whistle and lovely. And I think they're still evolving the style. And if I know Peter, it'll just end up being something rather yummy along my style.
Yeah. All right, well, we should probably bring us to where we are today. We're on the Mornington Peninsula, a beautiful sunny day. What were your first days on the Mornington Peninsula? And again, what kind of place did you find in terms of what the industry, well, if you could call it an industry, the ramshackle bunch of people who were trying stuff down here? What was it like? When were you first here, and how did you get stuck into the place?
Funny you should say that. Last weekend was the 50th anniversary of when Eldridge Estate was planted, and that's how I got introduced to the area. And a guy called Stephen Hickinbotham was making wine in little batches and doing crazy things like flying in a Piper Cherokee grapes back from Tasmania to make here. And he was making LG Park to begin with, I believe. And there were tastings that they were running in Melbourne. And at one of these, I came across Eldridge Estate, and I can't remember the actual context. But as soon as I started talking to them, I was thinking, you have to remember I was making Cabernet back then. I thought, yeah, that sounds like the right kind of place to grow Cabernet. And so I came down here and found Nat and Rose, and they embraced me. And Nat then said to me, I think it must have been about his second vintage, he said, how did you get a malolactic fermentation through? And I said, well, when I did a course at Charles Sturt, which was not the full degree course, because I had the science degree and I've been making wine for years, but they had this little demonstration where you go and stay there for a few weeks and lecturers would take you through various aspects. And the microbiology lecturer, a guy called Andrew Marquides, who ended up as the dean at Roseworthy, I said to him, how do you get a malo to go through? And he said, well, when you get your neighbours having it happen, you go and get a bucket out of a barrel and you put it in one of your barrels. And then when that barrel starts to fizz, you use that to inoculate your others. Now, this gets back to my sort of medical physiology, pharmacology training. and I'll just use the term sharing needles, and immediately all the lights go on anybody listening and saying, I can see where he's going. And if you're going to do that, you can risk all sorts of things being taken across. So I started to work on isolating the bacteria and then working out methods to do the bacteria. And to cut to the chase, I started inoculating Nat's wine for him. And that went on for a number of years. And then other people like Lindsay McCall at Paringa said to Nat, how did you do with the Malo? And he said, well, go talk to David. And next thing I know, I'm doing Malos for lots of people around even South Australia. But in that whole early carry-on down here, when it was a very exciting region, I would come down and pick grapes. And around that time, everybody was trying to learn, and they had regular meetings at the start of the Vignerons Association, and Nat set up that first Vignerons Association. And they then got me in to run some lectures on microbiology of winemaking and talking about Malo. And that's when I met the whole community. And so I got heavily involved with that community way back in about 81. Let's just jump forward to 95, when Wendy and I had been looking where to buy for a number of years. And we nearly ended up at Martinborough, New Zealand. She was shortlisted for a principal's position at a private girls' school, and they had to fly me over. So I was interviewed as much as she was. She didn't get the position, but because of the way it was very thorough, like a 3-day series of interviews. And by the way, the reason she didn't get the job was not because of me. It was because they had a former student who had been teaching at international school who knew the system better. I was offered a position at a local winery in Martinborough if she'd got the position. So I thought we could have ended up there. I thought maybe Adelaide Hills, going back to the old hometown. Looked at Gippsland and Yarra Valley, where I was helping another friend. And it just happened that we thought the Peninsula should be the place. And we looked and looked, and I thought it was the best. And by that stage, I'd been switched on to Pinot. And that was another monumental change in my life. Wendy always loved Chardonnay, but the Pinot, absolutely one of those get you by the ghoulies moments again. And I thought on the Peninsula was the place to go. I found it very frustrating because the style of Pinot we were doing, what I'll call on the hill, which is Ed, you know, is up here, and it's a cooler spot, was a bit lighter, and a lot of the wine reviewer types wanted a Pinot with more body and guts. That was quite frustrating because I quite liked the elegant style. And these days I'm a bit more nonchalant about that I sort of think back, well, some people want a bigger style and some people want a more elegant, lighter style. If you make a good wine, it'll work. So I was involved with the association from that very early day and trying to say how good the region was. My friends in New Zealand said, your Pinot's every bit, as in my region, was every bit as good as ours in Central. Why don't you do a Pinot celebration? So I then dragged everybody kicking and screaming into setting up the Pinot celebration. And the rest, they say, is history.
Yeah, and I suppose when we're talking 1995, I mean, Pinot's gone a long way since then in many ways, in terms of understanding sites and sub-regional potentials. Also, the original plantings, which they were effectively experimental, not as pioneers in the mid-70s like Nat, but a real fledgling industry. Another little wave in the mid-ish 80s. By the later part of the 90s, starting to get a real understanding of where those plantings were going, where the best places were. And obviously that's still gone on a tremendous pace since then. How would you characterise the evolution that you've seen?
One of the first parts I'll come in at was in around about 95, we started using nets to keep the birds off. And the famous story from Eldridge Estate was Nat's mother, who was in her 80s, going around the vineyard with saucepan lids and wooden spoons donging away to drive the birds out of the vineyard. I had another friend who bought a vineyard here who used to get up at dawn and go out with a shotgun, and it drove him crazy. And the reason people were doing that was we wanted to get the fruit riper, and nets allowed that to happen. In 2006, I was invited to represent Australian Pinot at the International Pinot Noir celebration. and it was their 20th edition. So
That's the Oregon one?
the Oregon one in McMinnville in the Willamette Valley. So we were all asked what has changed in 20 years. It was so obvious to me to say, well, from where I've come from, that we could get the fruit properly ripe, physiologically ripe grapes. And that was a huge change in 95 to do that. And then, of course, we started looking at clones and different clones giving different flavours. And obviously, if you've heard my little earlier comment about yeasts and stuff, some people said the same thing about clones, but no, I've learnt the first time. So I was more on target. And I think Jane Faulkner christened me the Clone Ranger because I was...
Well, you were the bacteria guy before, and then the Clone Ranger. It makes sense that the scientific thing is going to stay with you.
And once again, part of that was in Oregon. I'm just trying to think when it was. 97. A guy had a small vineyard in Oregon, and he showed me 2 samples of Chardonnay, both from a Sarug barrel, which we used back here. And he said, "What do you think? Tell me the difference." And to be honest, one was like drinking a white Burgundy from Meursault, just glorious. And the other was like, putting it crudely, Australian cask wine. And I couldn't work out what I said, "Is it from, I know you're buying a bit of fruit, is this from another vineyard?" No. And he just pointed out and he said, "See those rows there? They're next to each other." And I said, "Oh, God." And it turned out it was just a clonal thing. And it was so radical to see this different flavour. And that absolutely reinforced that even in Chardonnay, the clone could make a huge difference in flavour. And if you then dive into Chardonnay from Margaret River and you look at the Gin clone that drives it, how many times can you have a Margaret River Chardonnay and blind and think, well, that's Margaret River because of that clone? And it's the same thing when somebody shoves under my nose a Hunter Semillon with a few years on it. You can almost nail the part of the Hunter and that it's Semillon. It just stands out like dog's girlies. So, yeah, I think mastering the clones, then mastering the way we let the sunshine and ventilation get through to the vines, and lastly, controlling the yield so that if you have a year where in 2002 I actually dropped fruit, and for those who have no idea about 2002, the average yield was something like 250 kilograms, a quarter of a tonne per acre. And so I had dropped fruit around that stage. And the reason I was doing it was we had so much leaf. It was such a wet, cool year that I figured it's putting all its energy into growing leaves rather than the berries. And if I was going to get this stuff right, I needed an even smaller crop. And I had that 2002 Pinot about 2 months ago, and it was still yummy, obviously from a cooler year. But the yield is important, and I think we've got our heads around that. The key answer to that one is Barry Morey at Sorenberg and Beechworth in Victoria. He and I both have a love of Gamay, and in the early days when I put in Gamay, he was talking about he had an intern in who wanted to do some experiments about yield, and he had 3 patches of Gamay, and one ended up at about the notional stuff we do with Pinot, which for argument's sake we'll say was 2 tonnes per acre, and another one was more like 5 tonnes an acre. And Gamay is quite an evil thing; it'll just crop forever. And the last one was closer to 8 tonnes per acre. And Barry said, "Well, the 8 tonnes per acre was like rosé, so I made a rosé."
Just on Gamay, what is it that you like about that so much?
Probably it's easier to make than Pinot. Pinot is just one of those things like the problem child. You don't know how to communicate with it sometimes, and it doesn't respond, and you'll try everything, and it's still not the way you think it should be. Whereas Gamay is like that good kid who just goes along, gets the good grades, does everything, and you hardly have to do anything. And the classic example of that would be the acid in Gamay. One of the ways of measuring how much acid you've got is called pH. And neutral pH is 7, and when it gets below 7, it's acid, and when it gets above there, they say it's alkali. And wine is normally in the range of 3.5. If it's a Riesling, it might be around about 3.1. And if you get, for a Pinot Noir, much over 3.5, 3.6, it starts to, I think, lose some of the character and get a bit almost soapy. So you want to try and pick it so it's going to end up that way. And that thing that we talked about before, the malolactic fermentation, can, in some years when you've got a bit of shade there maybe, you can have a wine that you've picked it where you think's a lovely figure, and post-malo the pH could end up at 3.8. I've never had that with Gamay. I pick it at, say, 3.35, and post-ferment, post-malo, it might be 3.4, and you think, yes, you lovely thing, you. And it has this beautiful flavour that is consistent, and it always has nice colour.
I think part of that is you clearly have to work incredibly hard to make Pinot look easy, and it has to look easy to be good. Whereas Gamay is quite eager to please, and I suppose it's one of those wines of the world that does fulfil that role of being a people pleaser. There's something really convivial about that wine.
Yeah, and one of the other things that people don't realise, I used to get into trouble when I said I was putting Gamay in at Eldridge. And all the winemakers were saying, well, you get $20 a bottle and you'll get 35 for your Pinot or Chardonnay, and it costs the same to grow, David. You're stupid. And the reason we did it was we wanted a point of difference, and as you've gathered, we both love Gamay.
Yeah. I'm just going to take a little quote from The Essence of Dreams, which is Andrew Caillard MW's book on the Mornington Peninsula. Quite a nice little quote I was rereading this morning, waiting for you to drive up. Making wine on a Lilliputian scale is a relatively simple and straightforward task, but good winemaking requires significant capital investment in winery building, winemaking skills, technology, and maturation. It is this giant leap into the unknown that can take a hobby onto a precipitous journey to bankruptcy and marriage failures. Yet the promise of a life in wine can lure even the most intelligent people into a web of entanglement. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that dead on.
So Eldridge Estate, I mean, it is a beautiful vineyard, beautiful outlook, beautifully proportioned, I suppose, in many ways, and a patch of land that I know you developed enormous affection for with Wendy. You left it a couple of years ago. During the time you were there, just put into sort of perspective how you went about developing that dream that you and Wendy started.
Well, clearly when we bought it, there was a little issue that it was about 60% Cabernet Merlot. So we had to do some grafting. And that meant, if you think about it, that you've got to take those vines out of production if you're top grafting for several years. So people who were wondering why I was still teaching for a number of years and why Wendy kept teaching for about 10 years, 11 actually, start to understand that unless you're a super affluent person, it's very hard to do that. And usually if you're a super affluent person, you work under this illusion that if you pay a guru, the guru can do anything magical for you. And I'm here to tell you that the gurus who say, yes, you can grow grapes there, be beautiful. But the key question is, am I going to grow grapes that are going to make wine that I can sell at a price that'll be good? And the answer is generally no. And the second thing is, what about making the wine? Well, quite often you'll find that if you have wine made by somebody else, it can be good, but it's not the same as if you have the intimate understanding of working the vineyard yourself. Nat White used to call it the Burgundian model of the family who would work the vines and then make the wines. And the result was that you had this feel for what was going on. And in my place, that translated to an understanding with all the different clones that I was sampling as we led up to vintage, about 20-odd different patches in the vineyard. And then when it started to get ripe and the weather would do really weird things, intuitively I could say, because you can't run around and decide on picking morning you're going to change, we're going to pick this one because I know that's going to go ripen way over the top if I leave it another day from what it's done years before. And sometimes you don't even have to look at numbers. You can just look at the vine and know that when you're out there all the time. And that makes quite a difference. It's your patch of dirt, and you might only have it, as I did, for a limited time before you hand it over to somebody else. But it's that intimate working with the site. I know I'm totally biased because I had it for nearly 30 years, but I think Eldridge is one of the best sites for Pinot and Chardonnay, and obviously Gamay, that I've ever come across. Sadly, I think the two best Pinots I've ever made. One is the bottle I brought you today, which is from California, and the other is one that you haven't seen. It's from Coal River from 24. The Pinot from California is almost like if you said to David, what's the best patch of dirt you could look at? The patch I got in California was it. And if you said to me, all right, of all the clones you want, what's the one you want? That was the one that I had my hands on. And because when we had access to this vineyard, they let us walk and choose our own patches. And we chose the patch first. And when it came through about the clone, I said, what's this clone? And they said, oh, it's AS1. And I said, I've never heard of AS1. AKA Mazzini from Comte de Vogüé. And I knew the winemaker at Comte de Vogüé's who made Mazzini, and had tasted it in barrel quite a few times and saw how it responded over the different years. And so I just literally fell into my hands, and we had a perfect season, was 23, so it was a glorious wine. But Eldridge, it was a passion and a work of love to bring it up to that, which meant that you had a year or several years where it didn't pay the way because nature stepped in and it flowering, and you had cold, wet weather and you'd hardly get any fruit. You have to go with the flow, and it's hard work. And I was a little bit lucky with the Californian stuff that it just fell into place, and I happened to have the right gear.
Chardonnay as well, we need to talk about, because obviously the Queen of Chardonnay, this was her love probably beyond Pinot.
Yep.
You obviously had a lot of...
We're talking Wendy here, by the way.
Talking Wendy. What is it you love about Chardonnay, and how did you try and bring that to bear in the wines you've grown?
It's really tricky to answer, because that is a journey of evolution and discovery that was a little bit easier than Pinot, because Pinot's such a recalcitrant child. Chardonnay is one of these varieties that can do well all over the place, and it's more understanding the flavours that you can want and do consistently. And there are styles of Chardonnay that have lovely breadth of flavours, and quite often that can be a mixture of the oak, and it can be a mixture of some fermenting conditions, and also the site where it's grown. And I think Eldridge used to produce glorious Chardonnay, and it was fine-tuned by the clones once again. Finding the oaks that go well with your particular Chardonnay. It's very trendy to like a reductive flavour in Chardonnay. And I had it in 2000 and... when was that? Yeah, it was 2003. And when we had Aubert de Villaine from DRC out here, he tried it at a little bit of a tasting, and he spent the next 3 days coming up to me talking about it, that he liked it so much because it had this reductive edge to it. And I can tell you that I tried numerous times to make it where I'd get that reduction level right. But no, it's either too much, or if it's got a bit of the reductive stuff, I can handle it. If it's got that nice clarity of fruit and patch of dirt, but so often I see a Chardonnay where it's too strong. It's almost in the Gin clone and Margaret River that can just take over the flavour of the wine sometimes. Or if somebody's over-oaked a Chardonnay, it can take over. Or if somebody's had too strong a malolactic fermentation, and it's all buttery. What I like is the fruit and the patch coming through without anything putting up a hand like a kid in class going, me, 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 me. And it's all got this balance, and that's the Chardonnay style I like.
We've been reflecting inevitably, I suppose, in relatively weird times now, about the ups and downs of life and wine. When you left Eldridge, when you left the Mornington Peninsula to go to Tasmania, it must have been pretty bittersweet looking back. A lot of very good memories from very early days when you first started coming here, and that collegiate atmosphere, your involvement in the MPVA, the Pinot celebration, also some years where I'm sure it wasn't so easy, illness, and of course the loss of Wendy. Does working on a vineyard, does wine help deal with the ups and downs because they're so woven into the life of a vigneron?
Yeah, and the collegiate atmosphere here. There's a friend in Tasmania whose wife had a dual mastectomy and is having chemo at the moment, and they've got 2 kids running around, and I said to him, anything I can do because of all the experiences I've had. And I said, it doesn't matter, I can do anything. And he said, can you just come down and prune with me in the vineyard a few times? And so we chatted as we pruned, and I was able to borrow an electric set of pruners from friends here, and it was I only did it last week for the first time. It was very cathartic. I'd forgotten how much I like pruning. And the other illustration of that is after I had my really nasty cancer, where a lot of people thought I wasn't going to survive, and effectively in Peter McCullum for 4.5 months, I came home and the friends down here had run the vineyard for me, and I think 5 wineries had taken batches of fruit and made the wine. So I had to go to the various wineries when I was well enough to collect the barrels on my ute and bring it back. And I think the very first thing I did, about a week from getting home from hospital, you can't understand until you've been through this, where you've been flattened for 4.5 months and you don't feel that bad, but you don't have the energy. So sitting around the house for a week, I'm going troppo. So I said, right, post-harvest, I can go out and mow the vineyard, can't I? And this would be a task you could normally do in a day, day and a half. So I went out in the tractor, hopped on, started mowing. I lasted 40 minutes and I was just about dead. And I came back and I slept for 6 hours solid. And I gradually got stronger and better. But then COVID hit and we weren't really allowed to do anything. But I went out in the vineyard because I was stronger by then, by June, and was pruning. So I could be out there rugged up against the cold, earphones in, listening to music or radio or podcast, and very relaxing. I think get your mojo back. That was probably the time where I realised that maybe somebody upstairs was trying to tell me something, because Wendy had died of cancer. My brother had died of cancer at 64. Neither parents lasted past 64. I'd had my second cancer and was hoping I was going to survive this. And I'd been very fortunate in life to repartner with Carol. And not too long after we got together, she had breast cancer. And I'm thinking, I think somebody's trying to tell me something. I will add that all the tennis had worn out the joints, and physically I was struggling. So I paid somebody to come in, Sarah from France, because I said I want somebody who can come in and help in the winery, who can help in the vineyard, and doesn't mind doing 1 or 2 days a week at the cellar door. And she was fabulous. Somewhere in there I started to think along the lines of, oh, maybe I can keep going. You know, you're 70 and you're thinking, yeah, I could do that. That's when my friend Michael said to me, listen, Dave, you're not here for a long time, you're here for a good time. And he said, look what's happened. I think you need to make some wine for me with your mates in the Coal River Valley, and we're going to call this business The Odd Couple. And it gave me a purpose that I had something I could do. And I won't say it wasn't meant to be serious, because he wanted real Pinot, because he just basically does Shiraz, Cabernet, Grenache stuff and Riesling, but he loves Pinot. So I guess all came together, and I loved Tasmania, and I thought if I stayed here, it'd almost be like a thorn in the side with the people who are buying Eldridge, that you want them to do their own thing. And when they bought the place, they got Flamo in, and that's fine. If Flamo had a question, he could just pick up the phone and call me, and that was fine. But I wasn't dropping in and saying, oh, I see you've done this week. I did a little bit because my property was very tricky with the tractor work, and so I wanted to make sure nobody killed themselves. So I went back a few times and I ended up mulching the vineyard, quite a bit of it for them.
I did actually wrap one of said tractors around a wire when I was helping out down there, so yeah, it can.
So yes, it is a special task, and you can get a great deal of joy and relaxation out there. I was at a bit of a privileged stage by then that I had a reasonably good name, and the vineyard was such a lovely place and producing good wine that I could relax a bit. I think in that little quote, it's the amount of money required to do it. And these days it's got far worse, because when I started, it was along the lines of you'd need to spend a third of the time in the winery, a third of the time in the vineyard, and a third flogging. And now the flogging is just over the top because everybody's got this new angle, a narrative about their place, and there's so much bulldust going around. You think, oh God, what's the truth? And somebody like me who tends to not want to use all that sort of stuff found it hard. And I think the money still is really important. You've got to have that capital to come in and do it right. So the friend of mine whose 70th was last night, he's got the dough, and he'll probably be about one of the few people who'll be able to do things well.
Yeah, I remember being greeted by a certain someone with a Mr. Grumpy t-shirt on, which probably says a little bit about the public-facing effort of flogging wine, or even visiting wine buyers around town. Never an easy game. I have actually got with me, just behind me, a couple of bottles of wine labelled with the odd couple, one from Coal River Valley. You mentioned Flammo, Steve Flamsteed, who was guest on episode 11, and his project down in the Coal River Valley, so there's a lot to check out about why he's so excited about that region. And then the other one with a very slightly modified label, which has the two of you in your cowboy hats from the Santa Rita Hills that you just mentioned. A little bit more about this project, because this is the end game after an incredible career in wine. So this is a bit of fun. Tell me about the project as it stands at the moment.
Tasmania won a Jimmy Watson trophy, which if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I'd say I can't see that happening, because Jimmy Watson was invariably a big wine, Cabernet or Shiraz. And Tasmania's now won, I think, 2 for Pinot and 1 for Shiraz. And so I asked one very dear friend, and he was in the Coal River Valley. So he said, yes, I'll sell you a little bit of fruit. And initially we freighted, because it started the year I sold Eldridge. I made it at Eldridge. And then I made it at another winery facility in Tasmania from then after. And I think it was about the time I was going to do the second one, Michael came up to me, and he'd played golf with the owner of Sanford Benedict Vineyard in Santa Rita Hills. And the guy had said, do you think your mate would be interested in making wine here? And Michael said, oh, yeah, I think we would. And he then said to me, I've got this other person down the road. She's come and done vintage with me, and she's got this great winery. He then mentioned a name. And I'm thinking, how many female winemakers in America could be called Jordan? So I looked up the winery and sent an email with a picture of myself doing barrel sampling back in 2006 and said, Jordan, it is the same Jordan or not? And she said, yeah, that's me. And so I made it at her winery, and the owners of her facility probably have the largest reserves of oil in the US mainland, because they're both geologists, and they're not short of equipment either. And it was quite amazing to work at this winery with hot and cold running interns, which was good for a guy whose body was failing him, and having everything in terms of an optical sorter. It was just amazing. And the first vintage I thought was good, but the second vintage, the 23, was absolutely outstanding.
Well, that's what I'm holding in my hand, and I'm just going to read a bit from the back label. The Odd Couple, a David Lloyd, Science Boffin, Tennis Tragic, Tesla Driver, Vintaged Winemaker, and Michael Twelvetree, Brand Builder, Toyota Driver, Amateur Crave Fisherman, I thought it said crazy, Thoroughbred Lover. Both are passionate dog lovers and have been the dearest of friends for over 30 years. Lovely label, and a pretty good summary, I guess. We've heard about the science, the tennis, we haven't talked about the Tesla, but obviously a lot of winemaking, but a lot of friendship. Your travel has taken you obviously on those tennis trips, but also Oregon's been a big part of your life. Burgundy, from not a collector's point of view, but a friendship point of view, it's been a really solid part of your life. And of course down here, those friendships and affection for this land here. Your 50th, you say possibly last, wine came from the 25 vintage, but a pretty cool journey through wine.
Yeah, it's been a great journey, and I'm very happy with the way it's gone, and I see it as a journey that involves people and friends and fellowship. And to me, twice it really showed up. The first time when Wendy was diagnosed, and there was this new kid visiting the peninsula who was a journalist who was looking to learn a bit about grape growing. And I threw him on my tractor doing various things in the vineyard, who willingly did that. You know, yes, I am talking about Ed. And I found that very hard at that time, dealing with a wife who was convinced she'd be dead in 6 months. She actually managed 2 years. And the whole journey then changed. And when it came to prune, I think, were you there that day they did the pruning? I can't remember.
No, if I remember that. Yeah.
There were 28 local vignerons turned up to prune my vineyard in a day. Another group of people prepared morning tea and lunch for everybody. Very enriching experience. And then when I was sick, something very similar happened. And it shows you that journey of going through life and vineyarding, how good that is. And on a sad note, last year, Doug Bowen's wife Joy died very suddenly, and I went to Coonawarra, and there were people who I hadn't seen for 10 or 15 years, some of them, who still recognised me and came over to chat to me, and we're all there for Doug and the family. It's a community, and it's quite lovely.
That's it for this week's podcast, which is dedicated to the memory of Wendy Lloyd. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast, please like it, subscribe, and share it with everyone. Seriously, it makes a huge difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. In the meantime, big thanks to my friends Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and to my guest, David Lloyd. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.